Timelines are a useful technique when working with traumatic memories in cognitive therapy for PTSD. They are commonly used with patients who have PTSD to multiple or prolonged trauma. They were also useful for patients who blame themselves for what they did or did not do during trauma. This training video will cover what timelines are, how to develop a timeline of multiple traumas, using timelines to change negative appraisals of multiple traumas, using a timeline in generating an account of a specific trauma, and using timelines to generate updating information for hotspots. Timelines can be used in several ways in cognitive therapy for PTSD. When a patient has experienced multiple traumas during their lifetime, or during a particular phase in their life, an overall timeline of life events can be used to identify the key memories to work on, and to provide an overview of a patient's life, which gives context for the traumatic events. The timeline is used as a starting point to identify the main events that led to the patient's multiple intrusive traumatic memories and negative appraisals of their self and the world. In this video, you will see excerpts from therapy sessions with a patient who has developed PTSD following an abusive relationship. The timeline is first used to map significant traumatic and also positive events across the patient's life. The patient is guided to indicate which traumas are linked to current re-experiencing symptoms and those linked to her negative self-view. This helps the patient and therapist to decide which events to work on. So thanks for telling me about some of the things that have happened in your life. It sounds like you've really been through a lot.
Yeah, I have.
And I wondered if it might be helpful for us to actually map out some of these events using a timeline. Sometimes that can be a helpful way of putting the events in some kind of order, making sense of what happened. And it can also help us to identify which are the most important traumatic events for us to work on in more detail.
Okay.
So we could do that on the whiteboard, and that way we can add things or change things as we need to. Whereabouts would you like to start?
Well, I think things really started when my dad left when I was 5.
Okay, so we can start there. What do you remember about that? The therapist and patient work together to create a timeline to include key life events. In order to provide a context for traumatic experiences, they may include brief information about important parts of the patient's life, such as work or study and important relationships, as well as positive and meaningful life events. These can be formatted in different ways. For example, marking dates and significant life events above and below the line, or using multiple lines to indicate different areas. It can also be helpful to extend the timeline into the future to add goals and aims. It is helpful to take a photo of the timeline for use in future sessions, or transfer it to an electronic file so that further information can be added later. If the patient is comfortable to do so, they may also work on the timeline at home on their own. This can then be shared with the therapist in the next session. When a timeline has been established, the therapist and patient identify the traumatic events that are currently re-experienced. So we've got the whole timeline up now, so well done for doing that, although we can keep adding to it if we need to. What do you make of it now?
Well, it's good to have it all mapped out. It feels like a relief, but it makes me realise how many things have happened.
Yeah, there's a lot there, isn't there? And I know we said that some of these events we would need to come back to and look at in a bit more detail, and especially the ones that you get intrusive memories or nightmares about.
Yeah, some of them are worse than others.
Yeah, so maybe we can use the timeline to identify which of those memories we need to work on more. Which of these events come back to you most often in intrusions or nightmares?
I think when he hit me for the first time, and also when I had to pack a suitcase to leave.
Okay, so I'll just circle those ones for us to come back to. So when he hit you for the first time, and this was when you packed the suitcase, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay. And I think I remember you saying that you also get images sometimes of him threatening you with a broken bottle. Whenabouts on the timeline did that happen, do you think?
Oh, I think it was about here. That was when he hit me so hard I blacked out.
Okay, so let's circle that one too to come back to as well. Okay. Therapist and patient also identify those events where key problematic appraisals of the self or the world first occurred. So you mentioned a thought that you have, that you're an idiot. Can you remember when you first started thinking about yourself that way?
Well, he used to say that to me. So I think when he turned nasty, kind of around that time of Christmas 2013, I should have left him then. And I'm an idiot because I stayed with him. I should have left.
Okay. So if we mark on the timeline when you first started thinking that way about yourself, it was probably round about then?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Much of the information included on the timeline is useful to provide background and context for the traumatic events and helps the patient with developing a new perspective. The detailed work on updating trauma memories, described in other training videos, concentrates on those events that are re-experienced or led to problematic appraisals of the self or the world that induce a sense of current threat. The timeline can be useful when working on changing cognitive appraisals. The origin of specific beliefs can be identified on the timeline. It also provides an overview and context for the traumatic events, which can be particularly important when working on negative appraisals related to responsibility and hindsight bias. So it seems like one of the beliefs that's still really strong is this one that I'm an idiot.
Yeah, that's a big one for me. I think none of this would have happened if I'd have left him when he first became nasty and changed. And that makes me feel like an idiot.
It sounds like you're being really hard on yourself there. How much would you say you believe I'm an idiot and I should have left him sooner?
Oh, completely, 100% for both.
Okay, all right. Well, I wonder if we should use the timeline that we made when we think about these beliefs. Just because sometimes it's hard for us when we're looking back to remember what we knew at the time.
Okay.
So when is it that you think you should have left him?
Oh, loads of times, but definitely the first time he hit me.
Okay. So we find that on the timeline, that's Christmas 2013, right? Yeah. And what was going on in your life at that time?
Well, I just dropped out of college and my mum had kicked me out. So I didn't really have anywhere to go.
Yeah, okay. So if you had left him at that point, where would you have gone?
Well, I don't think my mum would have taken me back in. I didn't want to go back there either. So I don't know.
Is there anywhere else you could have gone?
To a homeless shelter. But they're horrible and I didn't know where they were.
So it sounds like there weren't many easy options for you then. Were there other reasons why you didn't leave him?
Well, I loved him and I didn't really want to believe that he would actually hurt me, I suppose.
And at that point, did you know that he was going to hit you again?
No, I thought it was a one-off.
Okay. So if we think about what you knew at that time when you made the decision to stay, we know that there wasn't really anywhere else for you to go, that you loved him and you didn't want to believe he would hurt you, and you didn't know that it was going to happen again. What does that tell us about that belief that you're an idiot or that you should have left him?
Well, I still think I should have left him, but I can see that there were reasons why I didn't at the time.
Yeah. And do you still rate those beliefs at 100%?
No, probably a bit less now, maybe 70%.
Okay. Discussion of the hindsight bias led to a loosening of the patient's belief that she was an idiot. The updating memory procedure was then used to update the patient's memory for the event. Her realization that she could not know at the time that her partner would hurt her again, and that her decision to stay was understandable, was linked to the hotspot of the event. Her belief that she was an idiot dropped to 10%. Timelines can also be used to develop a detailed account of a specific traumatic event and to identify key moments or hotspots. This may be a useful alternative or precursor to imaginal reliving if a patient has strong dissociative reactions, as creating a timeline is generally less immersive than imaginal reliving. It is also used alongside written narratives where a trauma memory is very disorganised, for example where there are significant gaps or the order of events is confused. They can be helpful for patients who blame themselves for actions during the trauma, particularly for those with hindsight bias, in the identification and discussion of the key decision points. So one of the memories that you have a lot of nightmares about is the day that you tried to leave him, is that right?
Yeah, it's a really bad one.
And you said that it's quite confused, that memory. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, the things that happened are just jumbled up in my mind. I know that I packed a suitcase to leave and he found it and he was really angry. And we must have been downstairs in the kitchen at one point, and I think I must have run out into the road because I remember being worried that the neighbours would see. But I don't remember what order these things happened in.
Okay. Well, that happens sometimes with these types of memories. They can get confused and jumbled. But it might be helpful for us to try and put it in some kind of order. So we could map it out on a timeline. So it started when he found the suitcase that you'd packed?
Yeah, he'd come home early from work and I tried to hide the suitcase under the bed, but he found it.
Okay. The patient and therapist use the timeline to map out the traumatic event in detail, including information on thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations. They may also use spatial representations of the trauma scene to help understand the order of events. Gaps in memory, for example those caused by dissociation, loss of consciousness, alcohol or drugs, can be marked on the timeline. In some cases, memories are retrieved from these initial gaps when the memory is accessed in imagination, or following a return to the scene of the trauma. In other cases, the full extent of the memory cannot be retrieved, but it may be possible to agree what was most likely to have taken place during the memory gap, using information from other sources, such as witnesses, police, or hospital records. Timelines for specific events can also be used to address cognitive appraisals. In this context, a timeline can help to identify hotspots and their meanings, such as appraisals about the order and timing of the traumatic event, or the patient's responsibility for what happened. So, shall we just come back to this moment here? So you said you were feeling really hopeless, as if he was never going to let you go. Should we try and update that? What do you know now that you didn't know in that moment?
Well, he did let me go, and I did survive it.
So that's a really important update, isn't it? And if we look at the timeline, how long was it before he did let you go?
Well, it felt like ages, but I know that the neighbours called the police and that they came quite quickly. So it must have only been about 10 minutes.
Okay. The therapist can then guide the patient to bring in the information generated from using the timeline to update the hotspot within the trauma memory. There is another training video available on updating hotspots. Key points. Timelines have several functions in cognitive therapy for PTSD. They can be used to map multiple traumatic events, to provide an overview and context to the traumatic events, and to assist in selecting which traumatic events require detailed memory work. Timelines can be useful for changing cognitive appraisals, particularly when addressing hindsight bias. Timelines of individual traumatic events can be used for establishing what happened, especially when a patient is prone to dissociation or the trauma memory is particularly disorganised. They can also be helpful for identifying updating information for hotspots.